Now, to start off the presentation, I just give you a bit of a brief outline of the presentation itself. So we just had our land acknowledgement from beautiful Julie McKay from Mattagami. Again, I'll take some time to introduce the Wabun Tribal Council, introduce myself as the MDA. Then we'll dive right in and I'm going to discuss the Wabun Model and the successes that it has had for our communities. We'll move in towards a little bit more in-depth of an explanation for the Wabun Model. So those are negotiated agreements throughout the mining sequence. I'll talk a little bit about the negotiation process, provide some best practices for implementation. Then we'll highlight some of the key takeaways for the negotiation and implementation of those agreements. And we'll finish off with a conclusion to the presentation. So to start, I'd like to introduce the Wabun Tribal Council. The Wabun Tribal Council is a nonprofit regional chiefs council that represents and advocates and provides, among many other different services, mining-related advisory services for 6 First Nations in the Timmins area. These First Nations are signatory to Treaty 9. Those communities are Chapleau Ojibwe, Brunswick House, Mattagami, Flying Post, Matachwan, and just recently added to the roster was Beaver House First Nation. Outlined in the image here is the territory, the Wabun territory that you're going to hear me describe. It is actually a visual representation of the aggregate of our member nations' traditional territories. So Wabun doesn't actually have territorial interest. It's just a representation of all of those kind of put together. And that's what we use and share publicly. So as you can see here, and not surprising to you most of you who are familiar with the Timmins area, so the Wabun territory is one of the busiest mining regions in Canada, really. So Timmins has seen mining for over 100 years. Gold was discovered in 1908. The Dome mine operated again for over 100 years and produced 17.2 million ounces of gold. The Kidd mine began operation in 1963, still operating to this day, and it is known as the deepest base metal mine in the world at a distance of 3 kilometers. Gold was discovered in Kirkland Lake in 1906, and operations in both of these locations continue to 2023 and obviously beyond. New discoveries occur regularly as prospecting and exploration, especially for the critical minerals, continues with thousands of mining claims within our community's territories. Obviously, it's very clear that our communities have been heavily impacted from mining for over 100 years now. And that image well, I guess it'd be your right, is just an outline of that Wabun territory showing all of the active abandoned mining projects along with all the critical mineral sites. I left off all of the mining claims because the whole map would be red. I don't believe there's one open mining claim within there. And I also left off all the drill holes because, again, I would just make the map very busy. But the point I'm trying to drive home here is that our communities are obviously very familiar with mining, and many members work directly or indirectly with the industry. The communities and the members understand the role played by mining in everyday life and promote responsible mining. Our community members are very progressive, open-minded, and reasonable. Why, you might ask? And that, again, is why I'm here, and is to tell you about the success of the Wabun Model. So our member nations have successfully applied this Wabun Model, securing agreements directly with mining proponents and also a resource revenue sharing agreement with the province of Ontario. So finally, ensuring that the communities are able to meaningfully participate in projects across their territories. Now, you might be wondering why I'm here and why you should be listening to me. So my title at Wabun Tribal Council is Mineral Development Advisor. I help facilitate engagement between the nations and the mining industry. I also help facilitate the First Nations participation in the federal impact assessment process, reviewing various different environmental permits, and I also help implement the resource revenue sharing agreement with the province of Ontario. So I wear multiple hats. So moving forward and trying to gain a little bit of credibility here is why I would like to explain why I chose that headshot of me in hard hat. So I could have opted for your regular professional, all done up, kind of like what you see me wearing today. But I kind of wanted to make sure I'd have a little bit of credibility and make sure that it's worthwhile listening to me today. So again, that's why I chose that picture there of me in a hard hat. So I've done quite a bit of work from the ground up, and I am very familiar with mining. So I'm non-Indigenous ally. I was born and raised in Timmins, and I completed my bachelor's degree in ecology and land reclamation at Laurentian University in Sudbury. So again, another mining town. I come from a family with generations of mining stories and history. So my great-grandfather, grandfather, father, who's actually at the back of the room today, and my husband are all miners. So basically that's all that I ever hear talked about around the kitchen table is mining, mining, mining. And again, glad to showcase one of my favorite pictures of me and my dad. I was actually able to go on a private tour with him to the Kidd mine, so we were able to get down to 9,600 level there. So that was a great experience. So again, moving forward now, like I said, I do have experience working on numerous mine sites in Sudbury and in the Timmins area, and I've worked on various projects throughout the mining sequence. So I think that's an excellent segue to show you this next slide, which is just a visual representation of the mining sequence. So it starts up at claim registration, moves into early exploration, advanced exploration, then we have development, mine production, and as many of you already know, we move into closure planning. So throughout my career, I have actually done some biological baseline studies at the forefront. So during your early exploration, when my husband was working on the exploration drills when we were 18, I actually went out to see what it was all about because I thought diamond drilling was looking for diamonds. Obviously, I was wrong. So I actually did a night shift with him just to see what that was all about. So yeah, I've conducted quite a few different drill site inspections, whether they be aerial or on the ground. I've done a lot of closure plan reviews, permitting reviews, ecological baseline studies, various environmental monitoring through advanced and operating sites. I've done some health and safety as well in one of the mills, so I understand the metallurgical processes and the gold extraction processes. I've also done some dam raise inspections, and I understand the building and construction of dams. And finally, one of the most important and important parts of the mining sequence is the closure. So what's going to be left behind after the mining project is completed. It's of great importance to our communities. So I've done quite a bit of closure monitoring as well, closure reporting and vegetation monitoring. Now, before I go any further, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'd like to take some time now and go through this really long list of different acronyms and definitions that we need to understand. Things like, duty of consultation or UNDRIP or FPIC, Aboriginal rights, inherent rights, treaty rights. Or I could make this a lot less painful and boring and just maybe at the same time highlight what makes the Wabun model a little bit different from everybody else's and highlight the successes of that Wabun model. So no, I kind of just wanted to scare you guys a little bit. We're not going to dive into those definitions. So what separates the Wabun model from the rest is it's an interest-based approach versus a rights-based approach, which is why you don't really need to know all of those definitions, because even after 3 years of myself learning that, taking quite a few legal courses, I am not a lawyer, and I don't feel like I'm in a position to best explain that. So we'll highlight what the Wabun model is as an interest-based approach. That is a simple, consistent, and streamlined process for ongoing consultation and support throughout the mining sequence. So we make it easy for companies to do the right thing and engage with our nations simply because it's good business. It's part of being a good neighbor, not because you must or because you're legally required to do so. The basis of our model is to forge long-term mutually beneficial relationships through negotiated agreements with industry. The agreements outline the parties' commitments and responsibilities to each other, and the agreements also are aligned with the mining sequence and complexity of the project. So bringing this image back in, again, the mining sequence is highlighted at the top, and this is literally a cut and paste from Ontario's consultation framework. So we've got claim registration through to closure. The first part of the Wabun model is known as the joint statement of acknowledgement. Then it moves into the Memorandum of Understanding, which is also known as an exploration agreement. Once there's exploration permits or closure plans that are being issued. Throughout that time, the MOU applies to the project, and then throughout advanced exploration with different trigger points there, whether it be the preliminary economic assessment or feasibility study, that's when the communities will start to engage and develop the framework for the IBA. So I'll discuss each of these on varying levels as I move through the presentation. The first step, as I mentioned, wrong way. The first step, as I mentioned, is the joint statement of acknowledgement. Basically, the community will receive notification from either the proponent themselves, for the really good ones who like to engage early, who have probably listened to this presentation more than once. So they reach out themselves or will get the notification from the Ministry of Mines. From there, there's a brief letter that's sent to the proponent from the affected First Nation, just signaling that your project is within the territory of one or more identified First Nations. The letter then informs the proponent, of the First Nations requirements for long-term support and outlines consultation requirements throughout the mining sequence. Sometimes meetings with the lands departments are had or as required. There is very limited engagement at this level with leadership or broader membership. Again, our communities support the Wabun Model, and that's what we put into effect for our communities. From there, the joint statement of acknowledgement is signed, and a summary of the exploration memorandum of understanding is sent as a follow-up to that. And the only onus to the proponent at this point would be an annual report to the First Nations summarizing the work completed and future work that is planned. Now, moving into early exploration, when the exploration permits are being issued, is the exploration agreement. So we'll dive right into that. So again, as I said, those terms are used interchangeably. The proponent is then required to apply for this exploration permit if they are using mechanized drilling over 150 kg as prescribed in the Mining Act. So at that point, the exploration permit is applied for. Again, the communities receive notification. In many cases, our proponents are really, really good and they engage early. We are aware of these applications going in long before we receive them from the Ministry of Mines. So again, the First Nations are notified. The exploration MOU content is consistent and it's like a template and it really rarely changes. That is the basis of the Wabun Model, and it's a consistent approach. That approach is key to having the model accepted by industry and government. So there's no favoritism. It clearly outlines expectations, responsibilities, and communication protocols over the long term. This approach and the signing of these, let's say, templated exploration agreements allows the communities to engage in hundreds of different exploration projects at any given time. It also facilitates and streamlines the consultation process on that side of things as well. And our community First Nations are understanding that exploration activity does not provide substantial community benefit as it produces no project revenues. The primary purpose of the MOU is to outline the First Nations' ongoing consultation and accommodation requirements throughout the mining sequence, making it very clear that long-term support will require an IBA be in place for that project to move forward. So you may be wondering at this time, what kind of stuff is discussed, negotiated? What are the topics or the content of this exploration MOU? Well, as you could imagine, there are definitions to the project area and activities. There are provisions providing for employment and training opportunities, scholarships to promote education within the mining industry and outside of that as well. As you could expect, there are environmental and cultural protection measures. So there's a process for ongoing consultation and review of permitting and reporting on project activity. And again, there's the environmental and elders committee involvement. At the bare minimum, there's always at least one committee that's engaged in the consultation throughout the project. There's also a revenue share as a percentage of exploration expenditures, and as willing partners, our communities also want to share or have shares or options in the company itself. There are also business and contracting opportunities provided for the First Nation-owned businesses and partners. And of course, as always, there would be a dispute resolution process and an assignment provision. So that is just basically saying that the agreement will be transferred to any new owners of the project. Now, the next step, which is the IBA content, is very similar, but in more detail. So before moving into talking about the actual negotiation or best practices for implementation, I figured I would highlight the differences between those different levels of agreements. So again, just bringing up this nice little visual, we're now moving into later stages of Advanced X. There's likely preliminary economic assessments, feasibility studies, some engineering, environmental studies, that are starting, and that's when that would really trigger that more in-depth conversation about the IBAs. So as with mines, the IBAs come in all shapes and sizes. Some have different names, such as resource development agreements and partnership agreements. Now, regardless of what they're called, they are becoming a very, very important, almost self-imposed requirement of these responsible mining companies. And that is because upon ratification, which is the community's vote to approve the agreement, the IBA is considered by the First Nations as consent to the project. So in the IBA, as I mentioned, of course, the IBA will outline the commitments and responsibilities of all the parties under all the same topics that I had listed, but again, in much, much greater detail, and of course, with the legalese that we need from the lawyers. These IBAs or RDAs are tailored to meet the needs of all parties and to the complexity and economics of the project. Now, our First Nations currently have 11 IBA, RDA, kind of between the 6 different communities. There are 4 negotiations in progress, and we have 2 that are likely imminent and about to start rather shortly. Our communities also share about over 100 exploration agreements, if not more. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this allows our First Nations to finally participate meaningfully in mineral development across their traditional territories. Now, as I mentioned, what is the trigger for the discussions to be had or for the IBA agreements to start? So like I mentioned, there's preliminary economic assessments. Again, based on the project, we have regular update meetings. So as we know, the project is heading towards Advanced X and like their bulk sample and all that good stuff. That's when we start really discussing and putting forward the framework for the negotiation of the IBA. So that's collaboratively developed during advanced exploration. And again, as I said, it's triggered by more in-depth permitting requirements. The framework addresses all of the good stuff, all the logistics, such as who's going to be participating in a negotiation team, budget, meeting frequency, locations, scheduling, communication protocols, and target dates. So that's all collaboratively developed with the proponent and the affected First Nations. The First Nations themselves usually appoint 2 to 4 representatives and various other technical advisors, so environmental, legal, business advisors. And I myself, as the mineral development advisor, am active as a resource or support person to the communities at the negotiation table. The proponent obviously covers the costs of the negotiation, and timelines for the negotiation of an agreement could take anywhere from 6 months to 3 or more years, depending on the status of the project and if it's stop and go. Again, as I mentioned, there's detailed negotiation of all the topics listed in the exploration agreement. So those are project activities and project area. Very important to have those defined. Education, employment, training, environmental and cultural protection measures. Again, business and contracting opportunities and financial participation in the project. Those are all negotiated in much greater detail at the IBA level. Again, driving home this message with this visual graphic, it's very easy to interpret, and it's actually easy to see how the Wabun model is very consistent and streamlined. There's 3 boxes at the bottom on top of the government's, I guess, mining sequence that you can imagine has quite a few more pinch points in there. So when it comes to the implementation of our agreements, as I mentioned, the MOU and the IBA have relatively same amount of content, or the same topics are discussed. However, when it comes to implementation, that's where there's a greater difference. So when you're dealing with the MOU or exploration agreements, you're often dealing with a representative of the lands department. It could potentially be a council member, but it's often one representative for the community that's just on board and understands the process and represents the community at the table. When it comes to the IBA level, depending again on the complexity of the project, there's often one or more IBA coordinators in place. They work directly for the First Nation themselves, and they are responsible for implementing all of the different chapters of the agreement. There's various committees, whether it's one or multiple committees, you're gonna have 4 or 5 people sitting on that committee. Sometimes there's the implementation committee, environmental committee, and so forth. They're engaged, so they become familiar with the project, understand the community's questions and concerns, and represent the community through ongoing consultation. Another part of implementation are site visits. Those are always fun. You'll usually have a lot of attendance. So they're often requested and well attended. And again, those logistics are worked out directly with the First Nation. I'd like to remind everyone here that scheduling of meetings with various First Nation representatives, especially when you have more than one community and you're trying to schedule meetings, it can get very, very difficult. So always remember to plan ahead, follow up often, and in writing. Communication protocols are to be shared with any employees or subcontractors, just so that they know how to engage with community members they may encounter when they're out in the field. And another part of implementing these agreements is update reports. So whether at exploration level or the IBA level, again, you could see the theme here of asking for things to be written down or provided as a report makes it easier to share within the community. So expected from each agreement, of course, are the financials prepared in accordance with the International Financial Reporting Standards. The work completed, the work that's proposed, upcoming plans, permit applications, whether that's early X or all these other various different permits. The communities like to be, well equipped and ready to review permits well ahead of time. Again, to prevent any delays to your project or permitting. So again, any project-related permitting requirements, and of course, any environmental or safety incidents or any, investigations related to those types of things. The communities, again, want to protect their environment and want to ensure that we are preventing any environmental incidents in the future. Now, moving into the key takeaways for negotiation and implementation. So like I've mentioned, and I hope you've all bought into it now, is the Wabun Model is an interest-based approach versus a rights-based approach. The best way for me to put that is it's kind of like a you scratch my back, I scratch yours. It's all based on building those mutually beneficial relationships. So when you're negotiating and implementing these agreements with our communities, please reach out early, often, in writing, and don't rush. The last thing our community members want to do is be rushed to review permits and provide comments. Be transparent, genuine, and honest. If you're coming to the table with ill intentions or you're not being transparent, we'll pick up on that very quickly, and it's probably not going to go very well. First Nations have differing views, so respect that. Respect the fact that there are different expectations and level of understanding about resource extraction within the territory, but our communities do agree to help each other and work toward a common goal of reconciliation and the important building partnerships with industry. Again, be understanding of the First Nations' limited capacity and resources. I'm not sure if you've ever heard this before, but it's true, consultation fatigue. So just remember, you're likely dealing with maybe 1, max 2 or 3 people within the lands department, and they're responsible for consultation on all these different permits, not just one mining company. There's so many different triggers for consultation that consultation fatigue is a real thing. So keep in mind funding, people, time, skills, internet and equipment availability, semi-remote locations. I know it kind of sounds silly in 2023 to be talking about issues with internet, But our communities, even through COVID, are able to use Zoom and Teams, but the internet's not always the greatest. So definitely seeking in-person meetings from here on out, please. So again, as I mentioned before, again, when you're reaching out, provide presentations, provide reports in writing, and summarize meeting notes. Avoid phone calls or discussions that person then needs to like translate and put on paper. Ask about engagement with committees versus community-wide engagement. And always remember when you're dealing with our community members, that our community members, they work to live, they don't live to work. So that's the big mentality. So if there are funerals, holidays, cultural activities, ceremonies, hunting and things like that, they will close the band office. And we don't count those as business days. So don't fault that. Don't fault our community members for that. And so I ask, and coming to the end of my presentation here, if you want to build more minds faster, then you might want to think of supporting and promoting our member nation's consistent, streamlined, and results-driven approach. That is the Wabun Model. Do the right thing because you want to, not because you have to. So as I've mentioned, it's an interest-based approach. Don't get me wrong. I know where all the pinch points are and the leverage, and we just choose not to do that. We want to engage with proponents, like I said, who want to do the right thing because they just know it's part of doing good business and being a good neighbor. And if you want to build more minds faster, then again, support the renewal of Wabun's resource revenue sharing agreement with the province as it further promotes our member nation's meaningful participation in the mining industry and work toward reconciliation. And so you are asking yourself now, why do we do it? It must be obvious. We're working towards reconciliation and sustainable futures for our youth and the next 7 generations. And that's all I have for you folks. I'd just like to point out that our executive director, who is often the lead negotiator, wanted to be here today. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it, so that's why I'm standing in front of you. And again, I've put my contact information up there. Please feel free to reach out if you want to chat, you got questions, or if you want to get in touch with one of our member communities. So whether that's Brunswick House, Chapleau, Ojibwe, Flying Post, Matachewan, Mattagami, or Beaver House, reach out to myself and I will happily put you in contact with them.